Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here and to be at a conference that I actually get to stay at. And so that has been very exciting. And I just want to compliment Conway for all of his work on this effort. He has worked tirelessly in terms of creating grace, but on this issue and knowing what he's done over the years on behalf of our communities and children. And we need to give Conway Collis a round of applause. And I also personally just really enjoy working with him on so many projects. And what an honor it is to be here at the California Endowment. We are so lucky in California, and I talk about this all the time now that I'm not in California all the time, about how fortunate we are to have foundations like the California Endowment and to have the leadership that goes way beyond philanthropy, but playing an extremely important leading role in our state and also in the country, and that's Dr. Bob Ross, another wonderful friend. Well, I am here right now to introduce another friend and to introduce a longtime community activist and organizer, somebody who has dedicated his life to fighting on behalf of our communities in Los Angeles, in California, and also around the world. One of the things that is very interesting about our new mayor, you may or may not know, is that he lived in Ethiopia. And so now we have Africa in common because that's an issue that I work on in Congress. But he has taken his international perspective to play his leadership role in Los Angeles long before being elected to mayor, but when he served on the city council. And all of us in our city have driven through Hollywood for years, and we saw how Hollywood was deteriorating. And under his leadership, there has been an absolute transformation of the Hollywood community. And it's not just that the community was transformed, but it was how it was done. And it was done with community residents leading the charge and helping him to lead his city council district, which is why it was exciting to all of us when he decided to throw his hat in the ring after having been president of the city council for so many years, and then saying that he wanted to lead the entire city. So now we are able to see his leadership citywide, but stay tuned because I know we will all be watching his leadership nationally. And you may have seen that last week he was at the White House in the Oval Office with the president, along with a number of mayors around the country. But I know that he is going to very soon take a leadership role amongst mayors around the country. So Eric Garcetti has just been mayor for 5 minutes, but he has already made outstanding contributions to our city. But like I said, stay tuned. So join me in welcoming our new mayor, Eric Garcetti.
Thank you so much, Karen, for that warm introduction. Thank you for your incredible friendship. And Karen Bass and I have known each other from before either of us made the silly decision to be elected officials, and when we had great lives before that. And she is somebody who truly inspires me, who I said during the campaign, if she had decided to run for mayor, I literally wouldn't have. But she is doing amazing things in Washington, D.C. And I think you hear elected officials praise each other a lot. I will tell you in the most private moments, I would say that Darrell Steinberg and Karen Bass are two of my saints, the two people who I enjoy spending time with, who understand leadership, who understand pushing a progressive agenda while still being able to be practical. And I want to thank them both for being here and being part of this today. Let me, though, thank all of you, of course, Conway, for who you are and the connector that you are. It's 1 degree of separation for all of us from Conway, which is how we all know each other. And Bob Ross, who has made this space and this place radiate far beyond Los Angeles, but nationally and globally as a place that is where change happens. And I'm so proud to call him a friend, to have very quickly and very early partnered with him, and thank you for the generosity you have given me in terms of making sure that we can create an agenda that brings city government together with the nonprofit sector. And for everybody that is here, you're here for a reason today. And I have a great speech written, and I'm going to read part of it, but I want to kind of start a little bit from the emotional side. I don't know how many of you read the New York Times piece on 20,000 homeless children in New York, or saw yesterday on this week an interview with the reporter from the New York Times who wrote that piece. And they talked about one girl, because when we write stories, 20,000 is an overwhelming number. How do we understand that? We can picture it's more than enough people that would be in Staples Center here, but you don't understand the individual stories until you take one. And Dasani, named by her mom after the Dasani water, which to her was something elegant and something graceful, was this highlight of the series, an 11-year-old girl who was both interviewed in the print media, but also you got to see some of the interviews of her by the New York Times reporter. And to see through her eyes the beauty of her spirit, to see her dance, to see her talk, to see her articulate that school was the place she looked forward to, because they all live in a shelter, a decrepit shelter in New York City. To talk about, when she was asked very movingly, you know, what does an ideal childhood look like? She said, well, the parents are drunk all the time, because when they're drunk, they say yes to the things you ask them. To understand the perspectives that our brothers and sisters are growing up in. And then when asked, the reporter said, isn't she an extraordinary person? And she said, yes, of course she is, but she's not unique. And when we understand childhood poverty, I want to start by saying, I hope that we can agree today that poverty should not be an issue area, and childhood poverty should not be a sub-issue area. That if we don't attack this understanding that we are talking about our economy and jobs and a vision of justice, well, we can make dents, but we should be looking to make sure that not just specialists in child poverty are talking about this epidemic in America. I came back, as Karen mentioned, from a very inspiring meeting on Friday. I had gone to the White House about 6 weeks ago, and the President very generously received me in the Oval Office, and I joked with him. I think there was some problem with a website that week or something. I don't remember exactly, but I joked with him that President Clinton had famously said that, when he asked how my job was going, that the two best jobs in politics are President of the United States or Mayor of a big city. And he said back, well, you can scratch President off that list. And we talked a lot about how cities were increasingly the laboratories for change in America and increasingly the agents of change globally. A lot of people have been writing about this. The Brookings Institution, Bruce Katz, and Jennifer Bradley have a new book out about metropolitan regions. Ben Barber, who's a great author and a professor at CCNY, wrote a new book called What If Mayors Ruled the World, which, besides being a very self-serving title, is an excellent book. And it talks about how mayors really are moving the ball. And the President said we should figure out a way that we can coordinate more with mayors. Long story short, that led to, on Friday, a meeting where 15 other mayors besides myself were invited by the White House, and all 15 accepted. 16 mayors sat down with the President, the Vice President, key members of the Cabinet and the administration, and spent a few hours, 90 minutes, with the President, the mayor or mayors-elect of New York, Boston, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Seattle, of Toledo, of Minneapolis, of Cincinnati, and Harrisburg, and Greensboro, and Chattanooga, and St. Petersburg, all together in one place. And we were tasked with going around the table and telling the President and the Vice President what's going on in our city and what we were going to hope to do as mayors. And it started with a more general, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. And little by little, people started to say, you know what, in places like Minneapolis, where they're recovering more swiftly, or places like Detroit, where the challenges are so manifest, they said, you know, at the top, people are actually doing okay, and they're coming back. But there's the big except. But if you're a child of color, or if you live in certain neighborhoods, or if you're long-term unemployed, it's still really bad out there. And little by little, more and more of the conversation, and by the end, probably 2/3 of it, was talking about inequality in this country. And I don't know if you all saw the President's speech on inequality. As they reminded us in Washington, most people don't sit around necessarily listening to entire speeches that presidents give, but it's one worth listening to. Because in that, and the President said, you will be hearing a lot about this in the next 3 years from the White House. But on that, this week on ABC, I heard Newt Gingrich say the same thing. And what was important is, no matter where you are politically, Newt Gingrich was saying it's time for the Republican Party to stop being so dismissive of poverty and for Democrats to rethink how we're attacking poverty. For the President, he said we can't begin to rebuild a nation if we're not looking at inequality. And here's my pitch from the city level, because it's one we worked on together at the White House. And I want to see mayors across this country take this call together, which is this city, which other people in the state, and insert whatever big city you want, may think is just a city, an island unto itself, is beset by poverty, starting with our children. And without us solving that poverty, my city cannot succeed. And you know what a drag this city then is on the state. And if we don't bring our states back, we won't have a country that is truly prosperous. When we begin to put the logic together of this not being an issue or a sub-issue, of course, we all care about poor kids. What can we do? Nobody is heartless, but it gets shoved aside because other things take priority. When we show a pathway that links it to everybody's prosperity, indeed to the American character and whether we will fulfill this nation's promise, I think we begin to see what it is that we must do. And I can assure you, together with Bill de Blasio and with Marty Adams and with the mayors that are around this country, we are going to make this a priority, to make sure that the American people hear this, but more than anything else, that we take the best practices. They were all asking, tell me about what you're doing out here in California, because we've heard about First Five and we've heard about universal pre-care, and many of them ran on universal preschool. And they said, what can we do to make sure we don't look at child poverty as just child poverty, because if you're the child of somebody who's long-term unemployed, and here's a statistic for you, in the Reagan recession in the 80s, 25% of the unemployed were long-term unemployed. Today that number is 40%. And the psychological studies, Gene Sperling, who heads up the National Economic Council, briefed us. He said, the studies show, the psychology studies, that being long-term unemployed is second only in its devastation and its impact, its psychic impact on people, psychological impact, to losing one's spouse. So the depth of this issue now, which doesn't just affect communities of color, there's long-term working white poor that have had 200 rejection letters over a year. And when we look at a budget deal, and I can't hold my tongue on this, that cuts food stamps and unemployment insurance that will run out for 1.3 million Americans and another 3.5 million family members, which means 5 million Americans will have already in their devastation now no pathway forward, no way to take a step forward, and will feel that sense of failure, hopelessness, and helplessness. We as a country cannot stand by and let that go quietly. So when we look at childhood poverty, I wanted to set the table for a moment for us each to make that commitment, that this is indeed an issue much bigger than kids who are poor, that it is an issue, secondly, that we can solve, and that third, America's prosperity depends on it. So, for those of us who believe that our best days are behind us, who think that we don't have the will politically or that we don't have the resources financially to do this anymore, I would say the evidence shows us otherwise. When we put our heads together to something like homeless veterans, and an administration says that it's a priority, and we here at the local level try to figure it out, in 5 years we cut the homeless veterans population by 60%. When you look at, I don't know if folks saw the New York Times charts, and forgive me if others have already talked about this, that when people say the war, 50 years on, the war on poverty has failed, there's a great series of charts that showed the impact of if we didn't have programs like Head Start and didn't have programs like food stamps, what would have been the impact. And you see actually a slight reduction, an overall reduction in childhood poverty, measured on a real poverty scale, not just a federal poverty scale. And more than that, they showed what the impact would have been without these programs. Because it's not just have we solved poverty, it's also what would have happened if these programs weren't around and how bad would it be then. We're extremely lucky to live in the wealthiest country in the world, but that is an average. And our child poverty rate is the second worst among the 35 wealthiest countries. The latest research has shown that poverty has a dramatic effect on children's health, that poor children having themselves increased infant mortality, more frequent, more severe chronic diseases that we know like asthma, poor nutrition, increased obesity, lower immunization rates, and less access to quality health care. We know that our most critical government obligation, which is providing a quality free education, poverty is the biggest handicap on students. When we ask teachers to get better, we don't ever ask them, by the way, describe your students, how poor they are. Describe your campus. Is there a clinic on it? Tell me about how safe it is to walk to and from school. 40% of our children who are entering the school system are not prepared for primary school. 40% of them. Now, that's better than a lot of states because of the emphasis we've put here in California, but that's 40% unprepared. And the high school dropout rate, we know, for low-income students is 7 times higher than high-income students. 7 times, which is not surprising because often these lower-income students have to provide for the family members. Even Dasani, at 11 years old, already you could see the role she has to play to help support her parents. So besides the horrible human costs, child poverty is an enormous drag on our economy. We're here because of our hearts and our faith, but if we were only using our minds, we would be here with as much commitment as well. It's estimated that $500 billion is the cost of childhood poverty in lower earnings, lost tax revenue, and other negative long-term effects, which means that it costs our state and our city billions as well, money that I need to put into things like our police and our fire departments, in our parks, our roads, and our libraries. Historically, our nation has made it a policy priority to support our elderly population who are poor with programs like Medicare and Social Security, and we've seen the success of this country's work. The poverty rate among seniors has dropped from 35% in 1959 to just 9% in 2010. It's time for us to make a national commitment of the same to our youngest residents as well. So that's why I'm so pleased that Grace has brought us together today. I know that you convened a similar conference in July that was focused on, with Congresswoman Bass, the National Foster Youth Institute, and looking at foster care as well, and I thank you for that, both as a foster parent and as a public policy leader. And you're finalizing, policy priorities which include reducing social work caseloads, early intervention, and support for at-risk families in that. But I'm also looking forward to seeing your conclusions today, because we don't need to convince each other. We're all here because we're convinced. What we need is convincing evidence and convincing programs to make sure that we move forward. And I assure you that my administration will follow up with you to put it on the ground here. And I've told this to .coms, and I will tell it to those who are social justice activists. LA is the best laboratory in the world. Make it work here, and it will work any place. We have the world here, some of the toughest problems, but some of the greatest hopes and opportunities. And I guarantee you, it's not just rhetoric. When I was there in Washington, and everybody turned to me, whether they're from bigger cities or smaller cities, and said, tell us how you're doing it. To qualify, for instance, for Promise Zones, which will be announced soon, and I'm really hopeful that we'll have one of the Promise Zones. We have a stop sign, so I'll wrap up shortly. Toughest job in business. You weren't just testing it, right? You have to qualify by having received one of 3 grants, one from Department of Justice called the Byrne Grant, one from HUD called Choice Neighborhoods, or one from Education called Promise Neighborhoods. We're the only city not only to have won 2 of them, but all 3. LA has, despite our complex geography of 88 cities in this county and 5 counties, despite our complex bureaucracy of so many layers of government, we're learning to put those things aside. Those borders, those boundaries, those silos are coming down. So let us find those solutions, not just for us, but what we can do to inspire the nation as well. We've had some high-profile wins recently here, attracting new companies, like a video game company like Riot Games, looking at ways that we can retain and even bring in some large job creators. But our best job creation is here, and I'll wrap things up by sharing 2 statistics with you. Los Angeles, post-recession, has a greater poverty rate and a greater gap between rich and poor than we did before. No surprise there, but disheartening news. At the same time, another statistic showed that high-wage jobs are on the increase and lower-wage jobs are on the decrease in Los Angeles. When I saw both of those as mayor, kind of trying to figure out what I would do economically, I didn't know how to square those 2 things initially until I realized what it meant is that jobs are coming here, but they're not coming to people that live here. Imagine if I were a mayor right now before you of a town that was landlocked or on such a bad economic skid that we were just trying to get our lights, screwed in our street lights. Imagine I was in a place where we didn't have hardworking people, or the weather was terrible, or a place that was landlocked or didn't have a port or an airport, a place that didn't have a diverse population. This would be a tough challenge. But I'm not mayor of those places. I am mayor of Los Angeles, where we have the most diverse, hardworking people living in the most incredible city with the greatest opportunities and the most diverse economy. Our challenge is not a jobs challenge, it is a skills gap. So when we look at childhood poverty, we must ensure that the health of the family is there. We must ensure that the pathway to skills are there. It's the reason I put an emphasis next summer on hiring 10,000 youth that we turned away from the city of Los Angeles in our highest poverty areas who wanted to work, who wanted to have the opportunity to get those skills, those lessons. Next summer, I think this city can hire 10,000 more kids, don't you? And I hope that you will join me in that commitment to making sure. I certainly don't let a CEO out of my office before I make the pitch of how many jobs he or she is going to bring to that summer youth program. We also, though, need to make sure that we have a commitment to taking those 40% of the kids that we know we can start paying more and more the longer we wait. Saving a high school student on the wrong path, those of us that have done it, is tough. Even a middle school student isn't lost, but we're starting to cauterize wounds instead of actually heal them. But if we can get those 40% of kids before to be ready for school, and then to emphasize those first few years, we know that that is what pays off the most. So I'm here to let you know that this is a commitment for this mayor, that this is a priority for this administration, and that I'm committed to working with our national and our state leaders to ensure that this isn't one of 5 or 6 policy initiatives, that this is a prism through which we refract our success ultimately here in this city or not. Who we are will depend on what we do and how we do this. So thank you for bringing people together. Come to us and let us know, because I'm always respectful of time as a former council president, that I want to make sure you stay on time. Some of the people who are key in the administration, I hope that you'll reach out to us to get to know. We're here to make sure that that happens, to bring down those rates, not just because of the statistics, but for every Dasani, that human story has to be taken in a right direction so that she'll have the opportunities that she was put on this earth to make. Thank you so much.